They laughed at her in the valley below. A girl, 16 winters old, dragging stone up a frozen ridge on a sled she'd built with her own hands, stacking firewood higher than her shoulders against the wall of a house that had no roof, no door, and no business keeping anyone alive. She did not laugh back. She did not explain. She just kept climbing, one heavy load at a time, while the wind off the mountain pressed against her chest like a hand that wanted her gone. The men at the store had a word for her: foolish. The woman behind the counter had a softer one: pitiful. Her own stepfather had the cruelest of all. He'd handed her a few folded bills, looked past her face, and called it fair. None of them knew what she'd found buried inside that ruined wall. None of them knew what was coming down from the north. A cold so deep it would reach into every warm house in that little town and put the fires out, one by one. And when it came, every door they'd ever closed on her would open again, because the girl on the ridge had been building something, and it was almost finished. The cold came first, before the grief, before the long walk, before any of it. There was the cold. It pressed against the girl's face the moment she stepped through the door, and it did not let go. She was 16 years old, and she was standing on a gravel path with everything she owned in a single worn leather bag. Behind her, a sound, a small one, a bolt sliding home on the far side of a heavy oak door. Not a slam, not a shout, just that quiet, final click, the kind of sound that doesn't echo and somehow never stops. She did not turn around. The man who had locked that door was not cruel in the way stories usually mean. He had not raised his voice. He had not raised his hand. He had simply pressed a small fold of money into her palm, looked somewhere past her shoulder, and called it fair. Edmund Coyle was a man who moved through the world the way water moves through stone, not by feeling things, but by wearing them down, slowly, until they were small enough to set aside. His wife had been gone only a few months. The girl was his wife's daughter. And to him, she had become something simpler than a child. A line in a ledger, a loose end, a number that needed to be closed before the books could balance. "This is more than fair," he had told her, and the terrible thing, the thing that sat in her chest like a stone as she walked away, was that he believed it. The bills in her pocket were crisp, new. Someone at the bank had given him fresh ones, and they crinkled stiffly when she folded them and pushed them deep inside her coat. A few folded bills. That was the price of a childhood. She did the arithmetic later, lying awake in the dark. Her mother had lived in that house for years, and the man had measured those years, and her daughter's claim to any corner of the world, at almost nothing. She was not a person to him. She was a problem he had finally solved. The girl's name was Hazel Mercer, and as she walked the long road into town, the wind found her at every turn. It was the kind of mountain wind that does not blow so much as search. Cold fingers slipping under collars, between buttons, into the small spaces a person thinks are safe. In her bag she carried 3 changes of clothes, a thick wool blanket, the best she owned, a little money that grew smaller in her mind with every step, and one more thing, a small tin box. Inside it, a handful of sewing needles that had belonged to her mother. Her mother's hands had been gentle and quick. They had taught Hazel to read a pattern the way other children learn to read words. to look at a flat drawing and see the shape it would become, to trust the lines, to trust the numbers, even when the finished thing seemed impossible until it was done. Those hands were gone now, but the lessons stayed in Hazel's fingers. She didn't know it yet, but everything that was about to happen to her would come from that. From a mother who once taught her daughter how to read a drawing and believe it. The town sat folded into a crease between two ridges, the way a small thing tucks itself out of the wind. It was the kind of place a traveler would pass through and forget by supper, a general store, a blacksmith, a church with a bell that had cracked long ago and rang slightly flat ever since, a boarding house on the main road where a tired woman charged by the night and made no apology for the thinness of the mattress, and a small library, one room smelling of old paper, where a woman named Margaret Tilden sat with a pen and read the people who walked in more carefully than she read her books. Hazel did not know any of these places yet. She only knew she had to find work, fast. So she went looking. She went to the livery, where a red-faced man with a pipe looked her over the way people look at something they don't know how to name. He had grown sons to do the work, he said. He was sorry. He was not, particularly. She went to the general store, where a woman named Edith Vance kept the shelves and kept everyone's business along with them. There was no work, but there was plenty of curiosity, and Edith spent it freely on the girl in the worn coat. She went to the laundry, the church, the blacksmith, door after door, each one closed gently, which was almost worse. There is a particular ache in being turned away kindly, in watching someone feel sorry for you, and still say no. By the fourth day, the money in her coat had grown thin. She had counted it that morning. She had counted it the morning before. Counting did not change the number, but she counted anyway, because it was the only thing she could control. And a person needs something to control when everything else has slipped away. On the fifth morning, she went to the post office to send a letter, a long shot, a note to a relative she barely knew, in a place she'd never been. The kind of letter you send not because you expect an answer, but because the act of sending it feels like doing something. While she waited, she looked at the board on the wall. It was crowded with the small business of a small town. Notices about lost livestock. An old flyer for a sale that had already come and gone. And in the bottom corner, half hidden, yellowed to the color of old cream, a slip of paper. The handwriting on it had faded to a pale brown, the way ink fades when no one has looked at it in a very long time. 1 acre, stony ground, the shell of an old stone cottage. On the high north ridge, the one the town called Gale's Notch. The price was almost nothing. She read it twice. Then she asked the postmaster about it. He glanced at the slip the way people glance at things they've stopped seeing. "Oh, that," he said. "That's been up there a long while. Nobody wants it. Just rock and wind on that ridge. The house burned out years back. What's left isn't fit for a goat." He paused, and then, more gently, the way a person softens before delivering bad news. "You don't want to be asking about that one, miss." Hazel folded her unfinished letter and put it back in her pocket. The town clerk's name was Harold Pike. He was a lean man, the kind who looked like he'd been carved from the same gray as the hills. He kept a small office that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper, and he was not unkind. He was something harder to deal with than unkind. He was honest. He told her about the property without softening a single edge. The house had been built long ago by a stonemason, a careful man by all accounts. And then, one night, a fire had started in a corner of it. The roof was gone. The inside was gone. Only the stone walls still stood, blackened and open to the sky. "It is, in plain words, a ruin," he said. He set his pen down. "Child, there is no heat up on that ridge. No working stove, because there is no working house. The winters here are not gentle. They are not something you face with a brave attitude and a thin blanket." He looked at her over his spectacles. "I don't know your situation. I won't ask. But I'd be doing you wrong if I stamped this deed without telling you. Plain. That place could kill a grown man with money and help. I don't know what it would do to a girl alone with neither." Hazel was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him a question that had nothing to do with fear. "After it's mine," she said, "how much would I have left?" And something in the clerk's face changed. He had been looking at a foolish girl. Now he looked again, and he wasn't quite sure what he was looking at anymore. He told her the number. She told him she had it. He was silent for a long while. "You understand what you'd be getting?" he finally asked. She looked at him, steady, not stubborn, something underneath stubborn, something with a floor that didn't give way when you pressed on it. "I understand what I'd be getting," she said. "Will you stamp it?" He looked at her face, not her clothes, not her age, not the worn bag on the corner of his desk. Her face. And then he stamped the deed. He handed her a key. Iron. Old. Heavy and blackened with age. The kind of key that belongs to a door in a story your grandmother might have told you. "The land is yours," he said. His voice held two things at once: pity and something close to reluctant respect. She closed her fingers around the cold iron, and it was hers. For better or for far, far worse, it was hers. The walk to Gale's Notch was not long, but the last part of it was a different kind of distance. The road gave out at a broken fence line. Beyond it, a track that had once been a path, now half swallowed by everything that had been growing over it for years. Branches scraped at her sleeves. Her boots slipped on ground that was frozen hard beneath a soft and lying layer of old leaves. The land rose, the trees thinned, and the wind found her again. Not a gust, not a breeze. A steady, pushing current that pressed against her chest as if it had been waiting for her, as if it had something to say. She came around a stand of pale birches, and she saw it. Cottage was too kind a word. It was a low rectangle of gray stone walls, standing about shoulder high in places, lower where the top had crumbled and fallen inward over the long, empty years. One wall was stained black, high above an empty hole where a window had been. There was no window now, just the hole, and a rusted iron bracket where a shutter had once hung. The door frame still stood, but the door was gone, and through that open mouth she could see the inside, a floor of packed earth, buried under years of fallen leaves and broken things. Overhead, through a great gap in what was left of the roof, the gray sky looked down at her, like an eye that didn't blink. This was hers. This was what her money and one morning of stubborn certainty had bought. She stepped through the doorframe. Her boots crunched into the cold litter on the floor. The cold inside was different from the cold outside. Older, stiller. The deep chill of a place that has not held warmth in longer than anyone alive could remember. The wind moved through the cracks in the walls and the gap in the roof, and it made a sound that was not quite a moan, and not quite a whistle. The sound of a place that has forgotten what it was for. She pressed the iron key against her chest and held it there. The last time Hazel Mercer had cried was the morning her mother was lowered into the cold ground. The sky had been shut like a lid. She had stood very straight. She had not let herself break, and she had not broken since. Not when the man told her the house was being sold. Not when he pressed the money into her hand. Not in the long, thin nights at the boarding house, staring at a stained ceiling, doing the arithmetic of her vanishing life. She had told herself the grief was finished, that it had done what it needed to do, and gone. It had not gone. It had only been waiting. And here, in the ruin of a dead stranger's house, with the wind crying through the broken walls, and an iron key cold against her ribs, it found her. She sank to her knees on the frozen floor, and the whole weight of everything she had lost came down on her at once. Her mother, the only warmth she'd ever known, the last small belief that someone in the world was bound to her, that someone, somewhere, was supposed to keep her safe, gone. All of it. She wept, not in great loud sobs, but in long, slow, exhausted waves, her forehead pressed against the back of her fist, her breath clouding in the freezing air. She wept for her mother's hands. She wept for the foolish, desperate girl who had just spent nearly everything she had left on a pile of burned stone at the top of a frozen ridge. She wept until there was nothing left to weep, and then she simply sat, quiet, her hands in her lap, listening to the wind move through the walls of the only thing in the world that now belonged to her. The land was barren, the shelter was a ghost, and winter, real winter, was a long way off, but it was already on its way. She slept that first night in the corner where two standing walls met and blocked the worst of the wind. She wrapped herself in her mother's wool blanket and sat with her back against the cold stone. She did not really sleep. She drifted in and out of something thin and shivering, never quite warm, never quite gone. In the morning, she walked to town and bought a little bread, some hard cheese, a few dried apples, a single candle, and she walked back. She rationed it all, small amounts at careful times. She sat in the least cold corner and ate and tried to think about nothing, because thinking led to places she did not want to go. The second day was the same. On the third day, she watched a spider build a web between two stones in the broken wall, working, patient, building something out of nothing in a place that offered it nothing. At least the spider has a plan, she thought. And then she felt so foolish for thinking it that something inside her shifted, a small thing, like a gear catching, where before there had only been slipping. On the fourth morning, the clouds broke. For the first time since she'd come to that ridge, a thin bar of pale sunlight slipped through the gap in the broken roof. It fell across the ruined floor at a sharp angle, across the collapsed hearth, across the blackened stones of the old fireplace, and it caught something. In a crack between two hearthstones, Down at the base, a small splash of color. Improbable, defiant, alive. A tiny wildflower, growing out of nothing, out of a gap in the rock where the soil was mostly soot and old ash, where the light barely reached, where the cold had bitten hard 3 nights out of the last 4. There was no reason for that flower to be there, no reason at all. And it was there anyway, because growing was the only thing it knew how to do. Hazel looked at it for a long, long time, and then she stood up. She bent down, picked up a piece of charred wood from the floor, and threw it out through the doorway. Grief, she was learning, had 2 shapes, the kind that holds you on the floor, and the kind that, when you've sat in it long enough, when it has finally gone cold, hardens into something else, something with edges, something useful. What rose in her that morning was not hope. Not yet. It was anger, clean, sharp, as cold as the stone at her back. She was angry at the man who had handed her a few folded bills and called it fair. She was angry at herself for the day she'd spent on the floor. She was angry at the wind and the empty sky and the ruin around her for being exactly what it was. And anger, unlike grief, has a direction. She pointed it at the mess in front of her, and she began to move. The clearing took the better part of a week. She dragged burned timbers out through the doorway. She swept the leaves and the filth with a broom she made from a branch and a bundle of dry grass. She carried out the fallen stones, the ones that had tumbled from the broken walls, and she stacked them outside in neat rows, sorted by size. She did not know why she sorted them. It just made sense. Sorted stone took up less room. It was easier to work around. She did not know yet that sorting stone is the first thing a true mason does. She did not know yet that she was becoming one. And it was on one of those days, deep in the work, hands black with old ash, that her fingers found something wrong. She was clearing the floor of the old fireplace, pulling out crusted ash and bits of rusted iron, and one of the large bricks in the back of it moved. Not much. Just a fraction of an inch. A shift that should not exist in solid stone. She pressed it again. It moved again. She worked her fingers into the thin gap above it, pulled, felt the grit of old mortar against her skin, and the brick came free, with a sound like a long-held breath finally let go. Behind it was a hollow, dark, cold, about the size of a large book. She reached in without thinking, the way a person reaches into the dark before caution can catch up to curiosity. Her fingers touched something that was not stone, smooth, wrapped tight, heavier than it looked. She drew it out. It was a small package, bound in oiled cloth, tied with a strip of leather that had gone stiff and hard with age. Her hands were trembling as she worked the knot loose, not from the cold, from something older than cold. The feeling of touching a message left by a hand long gone. The cloth fell open. Inside was a journal. The cover was dark leather, cracked along the spine. The pages had yellowed to the shade of old ivory. The ink had faded from black to soft brown, but the writing was clear. A firm, careful hand. The hand of someone who had taken what he was writing very seriously. At the top of the first page, in larger letters, Josiah Calder, his mark, the man who had built this house, who had set these stones, laid this hearth. And then, for some reason, the journal would slowly explain. Hidden something inside the wall before everything went wrong. Hazel turned the pages by the thin light through the broken window. It was not a diary. There was almost nothing of the man's heart in it. No feelings, no stories of his life. What it held was something else entirely. It was a working record. The careful notes of a craftsman building something he believed in. Every measurement, every decision, every mistake, and how he'd fixed it. And drawings. Extraordinary drawings. Cutaway diagrams of a structure built into the wall. Not an ordinary fireplace. Not a simple iron stove. Something different. Something with channels running through it. Passages where the heat and smoke would travel back and forth through the body of the stone, winding through it, before finally slipping out. He had a name for it. He called it the stone heart of the house, and he wrote about it with the quiet fire of a man who has solved a problem that has bothered him for years. An open fire, he wrote, is a beautiful fool. It makes a grand show of flame and sends nearly all its heat straight up the chimney with the smoke. A man burns a whole winter's wood to be cold by morning. But there is another way. The stone, he explained, would drink in the heat from one short, hot fire, and then, slowly, for a full day and a night, it would give that heat back, steady, even, warming the room from within itself, long after the flames had died. 1 hour of fire, a full day of warmth. This is not magic, he had written. This is the same plain truth that makes a stone warm to the touch on a summer evening, long after the sun has gone down. Hazel read that passage 3 times. Then she read the pages around it. Then the drawings. Then the careful notes on how to mix the mortar, how to choose the stone, how to angle each turn so the heat would not escape too soon. She did not understand all of it, but she understood the principle. She understood it the way her mother had taught her to understand a sewing pattern, by trusting the lines, by following the logic of a flat drawing, by believing the shape was real before she could see it, and slowly, kneeling there in the cold, she began to understand something else. The ruin around her was not a pile of worthless stone. The creek she could hear running down the slope, that was the smooth river stone the journal called for. The gray clay in the bank behind the house, that was the mortar. The fallen timber in the woods, that was her supply. The place that had looked like the end of every road was, from another angle, the beginning of a very specific one. The plan was, by any sane measure, impossible. She was 16, alone, with no training and no tools beyond a small knife and a little hammer. She had never built anything larger than a shelf, and the thing in these drawings was a structure taller than a grown man, made of carefully fitted stone and precisely mixed clay, requiring weeks of labor and a kind of knowledge she did not yet have. But the man in the journal had been clear about the winters. They were not something to be weathered with a good attitude. They came down from the north and did not let go for months. The kind of cold that took the unprepared without mercy and left no room for second chances. She did the arithmetic one last time. Her money, her months, the dead man's drawings, and then she looked at his lines once more. They were confident, certain, the hand of a man who knew exactly what he was building before he built it. Instructions left sealed inside a wall, as if they had been waiting all this time for someone with a reason to find them. She closed the journal. She tucked it inside her coat, against her chest, where the iron key had been, and she stood up in the cold heart of the ruin. Outside, the wind moved through the birches with its endless searching sound. The little wildflower was still there in the crack of the hearthstone, smaller than her thumbnail, impossibly alive. She had almost nothing. A dead man's instructions, a handful of months, and a pair of hands her mother had taught to read a drawing and believe it. She picked up her bag, and she walked the long road back into town, but not to the boarding house, not to the store or the post office or any of the doors that had closed so gently in her face. She walked to the small library at the back of the town hall. She pushed open the door, and the smell of old paper and beeswax met her. A woman looked up from a desk, pen paused in midair. Margaret Tilden took in the girl in the doorway, travel-worn, dark-eyed, carrying a leather bag and a small journal pressed against her ribs like something precious. She did not ask questions. She simply waited. "I need books," Hazel said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "On stone, on clay, on how they behave with heat." She paused. "And anything you have on how to build a stove that works." For a moment, the librarian said nothing. She studied the girl with the careful attention of a woman who has spent a lifetime learning the difference between what people ask for and what they actually need. And then she set down her pen. She rose from her chair. "Come in," she said. "I'll show you what we have." Hazel stepped inside. The door closed behind her, and the sound of the wind fell away. And for the first time in many long days, she was exactly where she needed to be. The library became her second home, not in the way a person settles into comfort, but in the way a soldier settles into the one quiet room before a long march. She came in the mornings, sometimes, when the work on the ridge had to wait. And the woman at the desk never once asked her why. Margaret Tilden was not a woman who filled silences. She filled shelves. She filled teacups. And she watched. The books she pulled down were few, but they were the right ones. A worn volume on the way different stones behaved under heat. A thin guide to finding good clay beneath ordinary soil. An old manual, its pages soft with handling, that spoke of foundations and drafts and the strange, stubborn physics of warmth. Hazel spread Josiah Calder's journal open beside them, and she began to do the slow, patient work of belief. Where the dead man wrote of fire clay, the manuals agreed. A clay that could take great heat without cracking, hidden beneath the brown topsoil. Where he wrote of smooth river stone, the books confirmed it. That water-worn stone holds together under heat better than the sharp, broken kind. Every quiet certainty in his hand had a foundation somewhere in those books. Josiah Calder had not been a dreamer. He had been a man who understood his materials, and slowly, line by line, the girl came to trust him. She borrowed a plain composition book from a shelf the librarian kept for families who couldn't spare the cost of paper, and she began to copy, not his words, but his meaning. She translated his measurements into her own hand. She redrew his diagrams in her own lines, because drawing a thing, she found, taught her the thing in a way that only reading never could. Her mother had known that too. "Trace it," her mother used to say, leaning over her shoulder with a needle in her hand. "Trace it until your hand knows the shape your eyes can't hold." So she traced the firebox, the channels, the path the heat would take through the stone, until her hand knew it. One afternoon, the librarian set a cup of tea beside her without a word. And then, just as quietly, she said, "You're up at the old Calder place." It was not a question. Hazel looked up. "Yes." Margaret was silent for a moment, her hands folded. "He came in here once, long before your time. A quiet man, not unfriendly, just gathered up inside himself, the way some builders are." She paused. "Folks said he was making something up on that ridge that nobody understood." Hazel touched the cover of the journal. "He left this," she said softly, "hidden in the wall, behind a loose brick." The librarian looked at the journal, then at the girl. "Then I think," she said carefully, "he left it for whoever came after." She gathered the empty cup. "Some people build things for themselves, and some build things for the next person who'll need them." She rose. "The books are yours," she said, "for as long as you need them." The plan was simple to say, and brutal to do. The journal was clear about where to begin. No stove, however well made, can warm a house that breathes to the sky. Seal the roof first. Everything else follows. A warm fire in a room with no roof was just a fire in a field. So before a single stone of the stove could be laid, the girl had to put a roof over the ruin. She spent her last small coins with the care of someone who knows there will be no more. A handsaw, a hammer, a box of nails. And then she rationed her food down to almost nothing, buying in small amounts she could carry, stretching each trip as far as it would go. The timber, at least, the woods gave her for free. The forest around the ridge was full of fallen trees, old pines, down long enough to dry, but not yet gone soft. She walked the woods and marked the good ones with a strip of cloth, the way her mother had once marked fabric with pins. And then she began to cut. The first log nearly broke her. The blade bound in the wood. Her arms burned within minutes. She stopped, breathing hard, staring at a cut that had barely begun. This was the moment, she would think later, when most people quit. When the work turns out to be so much heavier than the idea of the work that the gap between them feels like a kind of cruelty. She did not quit. She studied the problem instead. She changed how she stood. She learned to use her weight, not just her arms. She let the saw do what a saw was made to do, and stopped fighting it. By the end of that first day, she had 2 rough lengths of timber, and a kind of pain in her shoulders she hadn't known a body could hold. By the end of the first week, her cuts were straighter. By the end of the second, her arms stopped burning after the first hour, and started burning after the third instead. That was its own quiet victory. The kind nobody sees. The kind you can't explain to anyone who hasn't done it. She hauled each log back to the ruin on a crude sled she made from 2 poles and a piece of old canvas. She notched the timbers to rest on top of the standing walls. The first 2 sat crooked. She pulled them, recut, reset. The third was better. By the 8th, the notches were clean, and the beams sat level without any help. She laid old boards across the frame, the ones from the collapsed floor that hadn't burned through. She filled the gaps with split pine. It was not beautiful. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was. A patched, stubborn thing, built by someone learning as she went. But it held. When she poured a bucket of water over it to test, the water ran off. It shed the rain. It blocked the wind. And when she stood beneath it for the first time, inside a space that was, after all those empty years, finally a room again. She felt something she had not expected, a small, fierce, private satisfaction. The thing keeping the weather off her head existed because her own two hands had made it exist. She had a roof, and the stone heart was still a whole long season away. The work changed with the warming days. Now it was stone. The journal asked for smooth river stone for the outer body of the stove, the kind worn round by water, free of the hidden cracks that make field stone split under heat. The creek down the slope had exactly that, in abundance. Getting it up the slope was another matter entirely. She loaded the sled with stone and dragged it down to the water easily enough. The downhill run was almost kind. It was the climb back up that taught her what the work really was. The slope was not steep, but with wet stone weighing the sled and her boots slipping on the soft ground, every trip up was a long, slow argument with gravity. And gravity does not lose gracefully. The rope cut into her palms on the first day. Blisters rose. By the second day, they broke and bled into the cloth she'd wrapped around her hands. So she wrapped over the blood with fresh cloth, and wrapped again. By the end of that week, her hands had stopped blistering, because the skin had hardened into something that no longer knew how to blister. She made 4 trips a day. Each trip brought up enough stone for maybe 2 courses of wall when the time came to lay them. The pile behind the ruin grew, slowly, with a kind of math that had no shortcuts in it. The simple, grinding arithmetic of what one girl can move, one load at a time, against the weight of the world. Down in the valley, they began to talk about her. A small town is a slow, watchful animal. It absorbs an unusual thing the way it absorbs everything. First with curiosity, then with opinion, then, eventually, with a kind of settled background hum. And the opinions, at first, were not kind. Edith Vance, behind the counter of the general store, made her thoughts known to anyone who came in for flour or nails. "That girl," she would say, shaking her head, "doesn't speak to a soul, comes in, buys her little bit, leaves. It isn't natural. A girl alone, up on that ridge, doing whatever it is she's doing." A broad-shouldered farmer named Gideon Renner had ridden past the ridge track on his way to the high pasture and caught a glimpse of the growing pile of stone. He reported it at the feed store like a man sharing something funny. "She's stacking rocks," he said, "big ones, little ones, all sorted out in rows like she's fixing to build a dam." He laughed, and the men around him laughed with him. And firewood, stacking firewood higher than her own head in the middle of summer. There was a particular pleasure in the laughter, the pleasure people take when foolishness is on display. And it isn't theirs. The girl on the ridge was a story they told to feel sensible. She knew it. She heard the edge of it in the way conversation softened when she walked into the store. She felt it in the looks that slid off her and went back to whatever they'd been doing. She did not argue. She bought her little bit. And she walked back up the hill to her rows of stone and kept stacking. The clay came next. The journal was exact about it. The mortar for the inner firebox needed a special clay, smooth, slow to crack, the kind hidden in a gray-blue layer beneath the ordinary soil. The bank behind the ruin, where the slope had cut through the hill, showed exactly that gray layer, a couple of feet down. She tested it the way the dead man had described, rolled it into a thin coil, bent it, watched how far it would bend before it cracked. It bent nearly all the way. She pressed it between her fingers. Smooth, slow, right. She dug it out with a sharpened rod and with her bare hands, in heavy gray chunks that she carried, bucket by bucket, to a flat place by the south wall. And then came the mixing. The journal told her to mix it with her feet. The weight and motion of a body walking through the mix, Calder had written, will work it more thoroughly than any tool yet made. So she mixed it barefoot. Her feet sank into the cool gray mass. She walked back and forth across it in the warm afternoon, the clay pulling at her ankles with every step. She added a little water from the creek, tested the feel, added more. The first batch was too wet. It slumped when she pressed it. The second cracked. The third held the print of her thumb cleanly and released from her hand without tearing. She covered it with canvas to keep it ready, and she felt, for just a moment, like her mother, bent over a table, working a thing with her hands until it was exactly right. But the work was not a clean climb upward. It never is. Because one evening, deep into the building of the firebox, she lit a small test fire to check the draft of a finished channel, and the channel cracked. She heard it before she saw it, a small dry tick in the stone, and then a thin dark line opening like a wound, where heat had found a weakness in her mortar. She sat back on her heels and stared at it. All those days, all that careful work, and the stone had told her, in one quiet sound, that some part of it was wrong. She wanted to weep. She did not. Instead, she went back to the journal. By candlelight, she read the mortar notes again, and again, and there, in a line she had skimmed over, a warning about the clay drying too fast in the heat, about the need to work it slower, wetter, with more of the chopped straw to hold it together. She had rushed it. In her hunger to see the thing rise, she had rushed. So she did the hardest thing a builder ever has to do. She tore it down. She broke out the cracked section with her own hands, the section she had bled to build, and she carried the ruined stone back outside. It cost her the better part of 2 weeks. 2 weeks she did not have. 2 weeks closer to a winter that would not wait. And for a few nights after, the doubt sat on her chest like a weight. Maybe the men at the feed store were right. Maybe she was a foolish girl playing at a thing she could never do. Maybe the dead man in the journal had been just like her, a dreamer whose grand idea cracked in the cold, who hid his failure in a wall where it would shame no one for years. She lay awake with that thought, and in the morning, she picked up her trowel again, because the alternative to building was freezing. And she had decided, somewhere deep down, in a place older than fear, that she would not freeze. The money ran out before the stove was done. She had known it would. She had watched it shrink for months, coin by coin, the way she'd once watched it shrink in her coat at the boarding house, and the one thing she still needed could not be made from stone or clay or fallen timber. The iron door. The journal was exact about its size, its vent, the way it had to seal the firebox tight so the fire would burn hot and clean. A stove without it was just an open hearth that would eat her winter wood in a week. She had to have it, and she did not have the money for it. She sat one night with her small tin box open in her lap. Her mother's sewing needles lay inside it, the last thing in the world that had been her mother's hands. She knew what the blacksmith would give for fine needles like these. Enough. Just barely enough. She held the tin for a long time. Some choices don't feel like choices. They feel like a door closing somewhere behind you, quiet and final. The same sound she'd heard on the gravel path the day all this began. In the morning, she walked to town. The blacksmith was a careful man named Gus Holloway, who had not asked questions when she'd brought him the strange measurements for a stove door he'd never built before. He took the needles. He weighed them in his broad palm, and something in his face went soft and uncomfortable, the way a decent man's face does when he knows what a thing must have cost. "These are good," he said quietly. "Fine work." "They were my mother's," Hazel said. The words were simple. She did not let them tremble. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and named a fair price, and did not haggle. "I built 3 iron stoves this past year," he said as she turned to go. "Ordinary ones. They work fine." He paused. "If yours doesn't, you come back here, and I'll build you a proper one." He said it without cruelty. It was the offer of one craftsman to another. A hand held out, just in case. She thanked him, and she walked home with the iron door, and an empty tin in her bag, and a hollow place in her chest where her mother's needles used to be. It was on a warm afternoon, while she was laying the first careful course of fire brick, that she heard the carriage, not a farm wagon, a fine, well-kept carriage, complaining its way up a track that no fine carriage belonged on. She did not stop working. She knew the sound of that carriage. She had heard it once before, on the worst morning of her life. Edmund Coyle stepped down. He picked his way toward the ruin with the careful unhappiness of a man whose shoes were never meant for that ground. He stopped in the doorway, and he looked. He looked at the patched roof, the swept floor, the rows of sorted stone outside, the buckets of mixed clay, and the half-built mass of fitted stone rising against the north wall, where the girl knelt with a trowel in her hand and clay drying stiff on her apron. For just a moment, something moved across his face. It was not understanding, not quite, but it was a flicker of doubt, a small crack in the certainty he had carried up that hill. The scene in front of him was not matching the foolish girl he'd come expecting to find. He pushed past it quickly. "What in the world," he said, "are you building?" His voice carried the light, easy scorn of a man who thinks the question answers itself. She set the next brick, pressed it level. "A stove," she said. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "That," he said, "is a pile of rocks." He gestured at it the way you gesture at a child's sandcastle. "You'll need more firewood than this whole ridge can grow to heat that thing. You'll be frozen solid by the holidays." The certainty in his voice was complete. It was the certainty of a man who has made many confident predictions in his life, and never once kept count of how many turned out wrong. "A sensible girl," he went on, "would have taken what I gave her and found a room in some town, found a situation. Instead," he looked around the ruin and shook his head. "Instead, you're out here, playing at mason." He turned to go, then paused, one hand on the door frame. "Don't come looking for more," he said, "when the first snow falls." And he left. The carriage made its complaining way back down the track. The dust settled, and the girl did not move. She knelt there a long while, the trowel still in her hand. His words had done what words like that always do. They had gone straight to every doubt she was already carrying, and pressed on all of them at once. The thing in front of her did look, from the outside, like a pile of rocks. She was 16, alone, with bleeding hands, and a dead man's drawings, and an empty tin where her mother's needles used to be. And the cold was coming. Whether the work was finished or not, whether it worked or not. The shadow of the ridge came down over the ruin as the sun dropped. The room grew dark and cold around her, and she was still sitting there, staring at nothing, when she heard footsteps on the track. Not a carriage, not the brisk stride of someone with somewhere to be. The slow, measured walk of a man for whom walking was simply how he got from one place to another. An old man appeared in the doorway, not the soft old age of a man who had lived easy, the hard, compacted old age of a man who had spent his decades outdoors, doing work with his body. His back had the forward lean of someone who had bent over workbenches for 40 years. His hands, at the ends of worn sleeves, were large and scarred and calm, and his eyes, pale under white brows, were sharp, not sharp with temper, sharp the way a thing gets sharp from a lifetime of looking carefully and knowing what it is looking at. He did not speak. He stepped inside, and his gaze moved across the room, not all at once, but piece by piece, the way a man reads a page. The roof, the sorted stone, the clay, the half-built stove. He crouched beside the fresh course of fire brick. He ran one thumb along a mortar joint, testing it. He looked at the angle of the first channel for a long, long moment. Then he stood, and he said one thing. "This is a stone heart." It was not a question. The words came out of him slowly, like a man naming something he never expected to see again. Hazel looked up. The surprise on her face was not something she could hide. She had never used those words with anyone in that town. They were Calder's words, the dead man's words. The old man's gaze moved to her face. "My father built one," he said, "when I was a boy." He looked back at the rising stone. "You can heat a house for a full day on what you can carry in your arms." He reached down and pressed his thumb to the mortar joint again. "Your mix is right," he said. "Your draft angle is right." Then he straightened, slow and careful, like a man whose joints required some negotiating. "The course you're laying, bring the inner wall up 2 more inches before you start the return." He nodded at the journal lying open on a flat stone. "His drawing calls for it, but the mark is easy to misread." Hazel stared at him. "You know Josiah Calder's work," she said. He didn't answer that. Instead, he turned toward the door and paused at the threshold. His eyes went to the tree line, to the sky beyond the ridge, reading it, not with mystery, but with the long, plain habit of a man who has watched these hills his whole life. "The winter that's coming," he said quietly, "isn't going to be a normal, hard winter." A pause. "The signs are speaking plainly, if a body knows how to listen." He looked back once at the half-built thing against the wall. "What you're building here," he said, "is the only right answer to what's coming." And he stepped out. She followed to the doorway. The old man walked to the tree stump she used as a work table, and he set something down on it, a small bundle she hadn't seen him carrying. Then he continued down the track, without once looking back. She went to the stump. The cloth held a small loaf of bread, still warm, a wedge of hard cheese, and a flat piece of gritstone for sharpening a blade. No note, no name. She stood there a long while, holding the warm bread, looking down the empty track. Then she turned back to the ruin, to the chalk lines on the floor, to the rows of waiting stone, to the journal open to her own careful copying, to the mortar joint the old man had tested and found right. She had not asked his name, but somehow she knew she would see him again. She carried the bread inside and set it on the shelf she'd built, and she picked up her trowel, and this time, when she knelt before the stone heart, the doubt the man in the carriage had pressed on was not gone. But it had been answered by something heavier than doubt. She had been seen by someone who knew exactly what he was looking at, and she had been told that her work was right. That was not comfort. That was confirmation. And there is a difference that matters more than anyone could understand who has not spent long months working alone in the cold, with only a dead man's drawings for company. She set the next brick, pressed it level, and moved to the next. She learned his name later, not from him, from the librarian who mentioned it the way small-town people mention things, as plain fact, offered without ceremony, as if she had always known it. Elias Webb, a carpenter, long retired from the heavy work, a man who had built half the barns in the valley in his time, who was known for saying very little, for doing everything correctly the first time, and for leaving a place the moment a thing was finished, rather than staying to be thanked. She did not go looking for him. Something in her understood that to seek him out would be the wrong move, that whatever help he meant to give, he would give on his own terms, in his own time, and that the only right way to answer that kind of help was to keep doing the work that had drawn his eye in the first place. So she kept working, and he came now and then, the way weather comes. He never stayed more than a few minutes. He never explained his corrections, because to anyone who understood the work, they were plainly right. And she was becoming, day by day, someone who understood the work. He would crouch by a channel turn and study its angle. 3 degrees too shallow, he'd say. It'll draw, but it'll be slow to catch in the cold. And he'd mark the right angle with a scratch of his thumbnail and tell her she had maybe 2 hours to fix the mortar before it set, and he'd be gone before she finished. What he left on the stump changed with the season. The bread and cheese. Later, a bundle of dry kindling cut to a uniform length, perfect for testing a draft. Once, a slim old book on the way clay behaves under long heat, with his name penciled in careful letters on the inside cover. She read it in 2 nights by candlelight, and she understood things about her own mortar that she had only felt in her hands before. Down in the valley, the talk began, slowly, to change. Gideon Renner rode past the ridge again and noticed the pile of river stone had grown enormous, that the roof was properly mended, that smoke came from the chimney now. In short, clean bursts, while she tested each finished channel. His tone at the feed store shifted from laughter to something more careful, because Gideon Renner was a practical man. And practical men are unsettled by things they don't understand that also appear to be working. Even Edith Vance behind her counter found the easy mockery harder to reach for. The girl still didn't talk, still came in, bought her little bit, left. but she returned her borrowed books on time. She asked the librarian questions that grew sharper every week. And once, in passing, she'd said something about the way different stones hold heat that Margaret Tilden had found herself turning over in her mind for 2 whole days afterward. Natural, it turned out, was a word that meant different things to different people. The stove rose through the long, warm months. The firebox first, its walls thick, its floor tilted just slightly so the heat would rise into the channels instead of pooling at the bottom. Then the channels themselves, the soul of the whole thing, and the hardest part to get right. 5 long runs, winding back and forth through the body of the stone, each turn carefully angled so the heat would travel as far as possible, giving up its warmth to the stone before it could escape. Too sharp a turn, and the draft would die. Too gentle, and the heat would rush through before the stone could drink it. She built each turn 3 times in her head before she built it once in stone. Then the outer shell, the smooth river stone she'd bled to carry up the slope, fitted course by course, stepping slightly inward as it rose. And the detail she was proudest of, though no one would ever see it, a narrow gap between the inner firebox and the outer shell, 2 careful inches held open by small wedge stones, a gap that would let the hot inner core and the cooler outer face each swell and shrink at their own pace, so they would not fight each other and crack. When Elias Webb saw that gap one morning, he stood and looked at it for a long, long time. "My father," he said finally, cursed himself for half a year before he figured out that gap. He built 3 stone hearts before that one. Every outer face cracked by spring. The 4th time, he left the gap. He looked at her work a moment longer. "You had it from the start." She didn't answer. She just fit the next stone into place. But she felt the words land, not as praise, as something more useful than praise. The thing she'd gotten right was a thing that was hard to get right. A thing that had defeated experienced men before her, and she had read it correctly, from a drawing, the way her mother had taught her, long ago, with a needle in her hand. The last stones went up as the days began, almost shyly, to cool. She plastered the outer surface smooth with a final batch of clay, working it with a flat board and the heels of her hands until the whole stove was a deep, warm gray, bearing, here and there, the faint print of her own palms. She set the iron door into its opening, the door she had bought with her mother's needles. She tested the latch 6 times. She opened and closed the little vent through its whole range. And then she stepped back. The stone heart stood complete against the north wall, taller than a grown man, wide and solid and permanent. It looked as though it had always been there, as though the wall had been waiting all those empty years for it to come home. It also looked, she knew, like a pile of rocks. She had been alone long enough to hold both of those truths in her hands at once, without needing to choose. The journal told her to wait 2 days before the first true fire, to let the plaster surface dry completely, so the trapped steam would not crack her work. She waited. She touched the surface morning, noon, and night. And on the second morning, it was no longer cool to the touch. The surface moisture was gone. It was time. She gathered a small handful of the dry kindling. She built it into a little nest in the firebox, over a bit of dry grass and a curl of pine resin. And she struck a match. The grass caught. The kindling caught. A small, bright fire took hold. Cheerful and ordinary, far too small it seemed to matter. She watched the smoke. For the first 3 seconds, it curled back toward the open door, uncertain, hesitating, and then the draft caught. The smoke straightened, it bent, and it pulled, clean and sure, up into the channel opening and away into the body of the stone, drawn by the pressure that the dead man had designed into every careful angle. No back puff, no hesitation. The draft was working. She fed it a little more. Let it burn hot and fast, the way the journal said. She watched the edges of the iron door for any leak of smoke. There was none. After a while, the small fire burned down to ash. She added a few more sticks, let them burn out, and then she closed the vent down to nothing, latched the iron door, and waited. The room held a faint warmth from the little fire's flames, and within 20 minutes, that warmth faded. She sat on the floor in front of the cold-faced stove, and the disappointment that moved through her was sharp and specific. The disappointment of having done everything right and arriving at nothing at all. But the journal had told her to wait. So she waited. She ate a little supper. She read a few pages. She lay down on the sleeping shelf with her coat over her blanket, and she did not sleep. And then, some hours after the door had closed, she rose, and she pressed her flat palm against the lower face of the stone. Warm, not the sharp warmth of a flame, not the heat of an iron box with a fire still raging behind it, a deep, even, patient warmth. The warmth of a stone that has been sitting in the afternoon sun for half a day. Except there had been no sun. The warmth was coming from inside the stone itself, from the heat of one small fire, hours gone, releasing now, slowly, steadily, in every direction at once. She moved her hand higher, warm there too. By the deep of the night, the whole great body of the stone was warm to the touch, not in one spot, everywhere. The way a thing is warm that has drunken heat all the way through its body. And the air in the room. She stood in the middle of it and felt it on her face. The air was no longer the raw, biting cold of the ridge at night. It was the air of a room with a heart in it. She sank back down onto the floor, and she put her face in her hands, not to weep. Not quite. There is a feeling that comes at the very end of a long, long effort, when the thing you bled for finally proves itself real. It is not triumph. It is not even relief. It is quieter than both. It is the feeling of a weight you have carried so long you forgot you were carrying it. Set down. She sat there in the warm, dark room, with her face in her hands, and she breathed. The stone heart was beating, and outside, beyond the warm walls, beyond the mended roof, the wind moved down off the ridge with its old searching sound, carrying on it, faint and far off, the first true breath of the cold that was coming. The cold the old man had warned her about, the cold that did not yet know that this time, on this ridge, in this small and stubborn house, someone would be ready. The first snow came soft. It did not arrive like a threat. It drifted down one quiet morning, gentle as ash, and was gone by afternoon. But the girl on the ridge stood in her doorway and watched it fall, and she did not mistake it for kindness. It was an announcement. After that, the sky changed. It held a permanent gray-white quality, low and heavy, the color of something waiting. The light went thin. The wind off the ridge lost the last of its summer softness and found a harder voice. Down in the valley, the town moved into its old routines. Wood was split and stacked. Stores were counted. The sound of axes carried up the slope from first light to last, a steady chopping that did not stop. The people of that town had been through hard winters before. They thought they knew what was coming. They did not. Elias Webb came one last time, in the final cold days before the worst of it. He walked the inside of the cottage slowly, the way he always did. But there was something different in him this time. A finality. The way a craftsman checks a thing one last time before it goes into service and out of his hands. He ran a palm along the smooth plaster. He tested the latch of the iron door. He looked at the wood stacked dry against the wall, the food on the shelves, the whole quiet order she had built around herself. Then he turned to her. His pale eyes were steady. "You have built something," he said, "that will outlast both of us." He paused. "But the signs this year are not the signs of a normal hard winter. They are speaking of something else, something the old people would have known by name." He looked at the stone heart against the wall. "Whatever comes," he said, "you have done the one right thing. Everything else now is just waiting." He stepped to the door, and this time he left nothing on the stump. No bread, no tools, no book with his name penciled inside. He had given her everything she needed. What remained was hers to use. The storm did not come the way weather usually comes. It did not build slowly, with a darkening sky and a dropping hush. It arrived the way a door comes off its hinges. One moment the world was there, holding together, ordinary. And the next, it simply was not. The wind came first. It came in the deep of night, and it was a sound the girl had never heard before, not the searching current that moved off the ridge on ordinary cold nights. This was something with weight behind it, a long, low, structural roar pressing against the cottage walls like a great hand leaning on a door it meant to open. She had been ready for days. She had packed rags into every crack she could find. She had shuttered the small window from the inside with a board cut for that exact purpose. She had filled every vessel she owned with water from the creek before the cold could lock the path in ice. She had stacked the wood within arm's reach of the iron door, enough to last for days without ever stepping outside. And she had fired the stone heart that evening. One good fire, burned clean and hot. The door sealed. By the time the wind found its full voice, the stone was at its working warmth, giving its heat back into the room with that deep, even patience. She pressed her palm flat against the wall between two stones. The wall itself was cold, the way stone walls go cold when winter leans its whole body against them, but the air, just a few inches off the wall, was warm, fed by the stove. And in that small space where the two met, the cold stone, the warm air, was the proof of everything she had built. The cold was out there. She was in here. And between her and it stood the whole long season of her work. She lay down, and she slept. Morning showed her a world rearranged in the dark. The snow had not fallen so much as been driven, hurled sideways by the wind into places snow had no business reaching. A thin white line traced the inside of her windowsill, where the packed wool had not been quite enough. Drifts had piled against the walls to a depth she could not guess, and did not try to, because she did not open the door. She fired the stove. The routine was second nature now. Load, light, burn hot, close. She ate. She drank her tea, and the room held its warmth through the whole gray day, dropping only a little by evening, climbing back the next morning with the next small fire. The arithmetic was exactly what the dead man had promised. 1 hour of fire, a full day of warmth. She had wood enough for many days, and she would need every stick of it. By the second day, she became aware of a silence underneath the wind, and the silence troubled her more than the wind ever could. It was the silence of a town that had stopped making its ordinary sounds. That little valley had never been loud, but it had its rhythms. The morning smoke from the chimneys, the far ring of the blacksmith's hammer carrying up on the cold air, the flat, cracked note of the church bell. None of it came through the storm now. The valley had gone quiet in a way that did not mean peace. It meant shutdown. Somewhere below her, in houses she had walked past 100 times, people were learning what this cold truly was. Were feeding their iron stoves faster and faster against a hunger no fire could fill. Were watching the heat pour out of their walls quicker than they could pour it in. She did not know all of that, but she felt the shape of it in the silence. And on the third night, the silence broke. It came as a pounding on the door, not a knock, a pound, the flat, blunt impact of a fist that had lost the fine control a knock requires, the sound of a hand that was very, very cold. She was moving before she fully understood what it was. She pulled the board from the door. She lifted the latch. The wind came in first, a blade of frozen air that crossed the room, struck the warm stone, and died. And then the old man came through it. Elias Webb, crusted with snow from his collar to his boots, his face marked in patches that were not the red of cold cheeks, but a paler, harder red, the red of skin that has begun to take damage. He got the words out in pieces, his lips not fully his own. The Renner place, south of here. The chimneys choked with snow. Their stove went out, hours ago. He stopped. He pulled in a breath that shook. The baby, little Asa. He did not need to finish. She had her coat on before he had stopped speaking. "Can you get back there?" His jaw tightened. "I can get there." She moved fast. She filled 2 cloth bags with food from her shelves, the fastest fuel a cold body could take. While she worked, the old man stood near the stove with his hands held out toward it, not touching, just receiving the warmth from a few inches away. And his color came back. She watched it happen, watched his hands steady. The room was doing its work on him, the way it would do its work on all of them before the night was through. "Bring all of them," she said. "Anyone who can walk, anyone who can be carried." He looked at her, a long look. It held a question he did not ask. She was 16. She had wood for 1 winter, counted careful and close. She had food for 1 mouth. And she was telling him to fill her small house with whoever the storm had left in the cold. He saw the answer in her face before he could ask the question, so he did not ask it. He turned and went back out into the dark. She built the fire up past its usual measure. She opened the vent wide. She loaded the firebox high and let it run hot rather than careful. because the room would need to hold more warmth than one person had ever asked of it. She made the choice in the space of a breath, and she accepted what it would cost. The wood would burn faster now. The careful arithmetic would bend. But she had built a margin into her woodpile. She had built it on purpose months ago, because she had known, even then, that she did not know everything the world might ask of her. Now the world was asking, and she had an answer ready. They came in 2 waves. Elias first with Nora Renner, who carried baby Asa pressed against her chest inside her own coat. Both of them white with snow, both of them pushed past the edge of what a body can do. Nora's face was the particular blankness of a person spending everything they have on a single task. Not panic. Panic takes energy, and hers was all spent elsewhere. This was the quiet, narrowed focus of a mother doing one thing, and one thing only: keeping a small life warm with the heat of her own body. She had been doing it for hours, in a house gone colder than the grave. Gideon Renner came through the door behind her, head down against the wind, and when the warmth of the room reached him, he stopped. Just stopped. Stood there inside the closed door with the look of a man who has just been shown a proof that overturned something he had been certain of his whole life. The room was warm. There was no roaring fire, no leaping flame, no iron box throwing its fierce, scorching heat into one small circle while the corners stayed cold. There was only the stone, standing quiet against the north wall, its face warm to the touch, its warmth filling the room the way water fills a vessel, completely, without preference, reaching every corner at once. Nora had the baby unwrapped within minutes of sitting close to it, and the girl watched, from across the room, the way a mother's hands move when they are checking. The small face, the small fingers. The color came back slowly, from a frightening gray toward a living pink, with the patience of cold things warming. It was not a sudden recovery. It was a slow one, which was the right kind, which was the kind that meant the harm had not gone too deep. Gideon Renner sat down on the floor near his wife, his back against the wall, his long legs folded under him, and he looked at the stone heart with the undefended eyes of a man who has abandoned his old position so completely that he has not yet found a new one to stand on. Elias went out again, and came back with more. A family from the next holding north, a man and his wife, 2 young girls, and an old woman who moved through that door with the slow, deliberate dignity of someone who has decided that no weather on earth will make her less than herself. Her name was Della Hartwell. And the moment she was warm enough to move, she rose and went to the cooking shelf that projected from the upper body of the stove, and looked at the pot the girl had started. She did not ask permission. She simply took over. There was a quiet authority in the way she did it. The authority of a woman who has cooked for more people in worse times than anyone in that room could imagine. She found the cornmeal. She found the water that the stone had kept warm without a single extra stick of wood. And she began, with steady old hands, to stretch a little food into enough. The girl let her have it, without a word. This was not the moment to own a task. And the old woman's porridge, it would turn out, was better than hers. There is a particular grace in that, in an old pair of hands finding, in the middle of a crisis, that they are still needed, that they still know how to do a thing The young ones do not. Della Hartwell stirred the pot, and something in her face settled. 3 more came after that. Neighbors who had followed the light of the old man's lantern through the dark when their own heat had failed them. By the time the door was barred for the last time, the little house held more people than it had ever been built to hold. A house built for 1, now sheltering more than 10. The girl reorganized it all without complaint and without fuss. The sleeping shelf was cleared for the 2 young girls. The warmest corner went to the mother and her baby. The floor was layered with folded clothing, so no one had to sit on the cold boards. The cooking shelf produced a steady stream of warm water, then thin porridge, then the soup she had started hours before. When the old man first pounded on her door, she had not planned for 10. She had planned for difficulty. And difficulty, it turned out, was close enough. The night deepened. The wind went on and on, a sound so constant that the ear stopped hearing it, and only the body felt it, pressing on the walls. And inside, in the warm, the people began to come back to themselves. Gideon Renner moved after a while from the floor to a seat beside the girl at her work table. He looked at the composition book open in front of her, the diagrams, the careful copied measurements, the dead man's drawings beside her own. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. And then he said it. "I called you a fool." His voice held no performance of sorrow, just the flat delivery of a fact he had decided to put on the table. "At the feed store, in front of the others. I want you to know that I said it." The girl looked at the diagram in front of her. "I know you did," she said. He was quiet a moment. "How long did it take you?" he asked. "To build it?" "A season," she said. "Start to finish." He looked at the stone, at the thing he had once compared to a child's pile of rocks. "My grandfather used to say," he said slowly, "that the people who call a thing impossible are usually the ones who never tried it." He shook his head, a small, tired motion. "I don't know if he really said that, or if I'm just telling myself he did, to feel better right now." And something moved through the room at that. Not laughter, not quite, not in those circumstances, but a lightening, a small loosening of the air. The old woman at the pot made a sound that was its own quiet comment. The girl did not smile, but the hard set of her shoulders eased just slightly. She set the next thought aside and rose to check the fire. The storm did not relent. The next day was the day the valley understood, all the way down to its bones, what it was facing. Word could not travel. The way out was buried. That little town, folded into its crease between the ridges, was alone now with the cold. And the wood piles that had seemed so generous in the gentler months were proving thin against a cold that would not stop taking. Down below, families were feeding their stoves through the night and still watching their breath cloud indoors. Some had begun to burn what they could not afford to lose. But up on the ridge, in the small, stubborn house, the stone heart burned for an hour each morning and held its warmth through the day and into the night. The room was not warm by any measure of comfort, but it was warm enough, and the gap between warm enough and the killing cold outside was the gap between living and not. The people in that house found their way back to themselves slowly over the long second day. Nora Renner found her steadiness again. The old woman ruled the cooking shelf with a calm that no storm could touch. The two young girls discovered that the base of the stove was the warmest spot in the world and claimed it with the territorial efficiency of children everywhere. And Elias Webb, his hands long since healed, sat in his corner with the deep calm of a man who has been through hard things before and knows that they end. And then, on the fourth day of the storm, came the last knock. The girl heard it differently from the first one. The first knock, the old man's knock, had been desperate. This one was something else. Heavier. Slower. The knock of a man who has used the very last of himself, just getting to the door. She opened it, and the wind brought in a figure she had not prepared herself for, though she knew him in an instant. Edmund Coyle. He had not floundered up the buried track on foot for nothing. He had come as far as a sleigh could carry him, and then walked the last hard stretch alone, through drifts that reached his chest. His fine wool coat was intact, but it was sheathed in ice from the waist down. His hat was gone, and his hands, his bare hands, showed the early, frightening signs of real cold injury. Stiff, pale at the fingertips, the skin pulling tight and waxen across the knuckles. He had been out in a cold no man should face unprepared. And he had been, she could see it plainly, afraid. Afraid in the specific way that strips a person of everything they have built around themselves. The way deep cold strips the heat from a body. Indifferently. Completely. With no interest at all in who you think you are. He stood inside the door, and he looked at the room. More than 10 people in a house built for one. A stone stove giving its quiet warmth into a space that should have been impossible to keep alive. His neighbors, people he had done business with, sat beside in church, passed in the road for years, sitting on a girl's floor, in a girl's house, because she had built something that worked, and they had built things that had not. And in the center of it all, moving from the cooking shelf to the sleeping corner to the door, steady and unhurried, the girl he had handed a few folded bills and called it fair. When his voice came, it was small, not small with feeling, small with the plain fact of a body that had spent nearly all its warmth just to arrive. Hazel! He stopped. He tried again. The house is gone. The cold got into the walls in the night. Everything in it froze and split. The heat failed. I have had nowhere. He looked at his ruined hands, then back at her. I will pay whatever you ask, he said. Name it. The room had gone entirely still. Even the old woman had stopped her stirring. The girl looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him the way you look at something you have spent a great deal of time thinking about, not seeing it fresh, seeing it clearly, which is a different thing. Edmund Coyle, the man who had measured her mother's years and her own claim to the world at almost nothing. Stripped now of the carriage and the fine new bills, and the easy scorn, standing in her doorway, asking for the warmth she had built with her own bleeding hands, out of a hillside he had called worthless. There was no triumph in it for her. Triumph needs an enemy, and what stood in front of her was not an enemy anymore. It was just a man in trouble, which was a thing she had been herself for a long season, and understood far too well to enjoy seeing in anyone else. There is no price for warmth in this house, she said. The words came out level, not cold, not warm, simply true. But there is something you owe this room, and I want you to pay it. Before you sit down." His eyes moved across the faces watching him, and he understood at once what she meant. She could see the understanding arrive in him, in the way his shoulders changed, in the small, helpless rearrangement of his face. For a moment he looked like a man searching for an exit. There was none. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "The truth," she said, "about what you did. These people should know why you are standing at my door, instead of in your own house." The silence stretched long. The old woman set down her spoon. The baby, in his mother's arms, made a small sound and went quiet again. Edmund Coyle began the way such men always begin. It was a business arrangement, he said. The words automatic. The first defense of a man who has explained himself in the language of ledgers for so long that the language comes before the thought. The room absorbed it without a sound. And in that silence, he heard what it sounded like. He heard it himself. And he stopped halfway through. He started again. He said he had made a legal decision, and a financial one, and that both were correct by any measure the law would recognize. In his corner, the old man did not move. But the weight of his attention, in that moment, filled the room. Gideon Renner was looking at his own hands. The mother had pulled her older girl closer against her side. Edmund stopped a second time, and the third attempt came from somewhere else, somewhere lower, without the scaffolding of legal words, and so it was both smaller and far more true. "I knew what that money meant," he said quietly. "To a girl of 16 with no one left in the world, I knew it was not enough to build a life on." He looked at the floor. "I told myself it was, because that made the figures balance. I told myself she was young, that she was capable, that she would find her way." He drew a breath. "What I meant was that I did not want to be troubled by the fact that she might not." He looked up, not at the girl, at the room, at the specific people in it. "I left her here to die," he said. "That is what I did," said plainly, without the words I usually use to make it sound like something else. The room held it. No one moved to make it easier for him, but no one moved to add to it either. There is a mercy in that kind of silence. The mercy of letting a true thing simply stand, without anyone needing to sharpen it. The girl crossed the room to the cooking shelf. She filled a tin cup with hot tea from the pot that had sat at the back of the warm stone for an hour, still hot, kept so by the heat in the stone alone, without a single extra stick of wood. She carried it back to Edmund Coyle, and she held it out to him. He took it with his stiff, ruined hands, and she watched the warmth of the cup move into his fingers. Watched something in his face break open, quietly, where the cold had not been able to reach. Then she turned back to the room. "Find a space on the floor," she said, to the room in general, to him in particular. "There's porridge," she said, "in 20 minutes. And outside, the wind went on. The storm pressed against the walls of the small house with all its weight and all its hunger, and could not get in, because a girl that the whole valley had laughed at, a girl who had hauled stone up a frozen slope until her hands bled, who had traded the last of her mother's hands for an iron door, who had read a dead man's drawings by candlelight and believed them, had built a heart of stone against the cold, and it was beating, steady, warm, and strong enough now to hold them all. The storm broke on the seventh day. It did not fade the way most things fade, slowly, with a long gray easing. It simply stopped, all at once, the way a sound a person has lived inside for so long that they have forgotten it was ever there. Suddenly as not. The girl woke into a silence so deep and so complete that she lay still for a long while, certain that something was wrong. She listened, and slowly she understood. Nothing was wrong. The thing that had been wrong. The great pressing roar that had leaned against the walls for days and nights without end was gone. She rose quietly. The floor of the small house was covered with sleeping bodies, wrapped in every blanket and coat the room could offer, gathered close to the warm stone like creatures around the last fire in the world. She stepped between them carefully. A mother and her baby, two young sisters tangled together in sleep, an old woman breathing slow and even, an old man in the corner, his white head bowed. She reached the door, and she lifted the latch and she opened it. The world outside was white, and still, and deep beyond measuring. The drifts against the walls had climbed nearly to the eaves, smooth and sculpted and shining. The track to town had vanished altogether, buried under an unbroken blanket that caught the first light and threw it back, pink and gold, and impossibly clean. The sky above was the hard, washed blue of cold air finally cleared of all its violence, packed from ridge to ridge with the last of the fading stars. The cold she felt on her face was still sharp, but it was an ordinary sharpness now, the kind a person could meet and manage and walk through. The killing thing had passed in the night. She stood in the doorway with one hand resting on the frame, the warm air of the room pressing gently against her back, and she watched the dawn come up over a silent, buried world. Behind her, in the warmth, slept more than 10 people who would not have lived to see this morning in any other house on that ridge. She did not think of it as a victory. Standing there in the great hush of it, she thought of it as something quieter than that. She thought of it as enough. They woke slowly, one by one, into the strange new silence. And the first thing each of them did, before anything else, was to lie still and listen, the way she had. To search for the roar that was no longer there. To understand, as she had, that they had come through. The old man, Elias Webb, woke without a sound and simply opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling and knew. The two young sisters woke and crept to the door to see the buried world, and one of them gasped and the other laughed, the bright, unguarded laugh of a child who does not yet know how close a thing has been. And the grown ones woke the way grown people wake after a hard night. Heavy, careful, carrying the memory of the fear even as the fear let go. But the thing that had changed most could be seen in how they looked at her. They had come to her as strangers in the dark, carried in half frozen, with no choice and no time for anything but survival. They had spent the long days of the storm in her small, warm house, eating the food off her shelves and sleeping on her floor, and watching the gray stone against the north wall give and give and give its warmth, asking nothing in return. And now, in the morning light, when their eyes found the girl who had opened her door to them, there was no pity in those eyes anymore. There was no careful distance, no amusement. None of the things that had followed her up and down the valley for so long. There was something else, something that did not yet have a name, something that lived in the space between gratitude and awe and a kind of shame for having ever laughed. She felt it land on her, all those eyes, and she did not quite know what to do with it. So she did what she always did. She went to the stove. She built the morning fire. Load, light, burn hot, close. And she set water to warm on the cooking shelf, and the ordinary work steadied her, the way it always had. They went home slowly over the days that followed. There was no rushing it. The paths had to be dug out, shovel by shovel, through drifts taller than a man. The damage had to be counted. The frozen stores, the small wreckages the deep cold had left, scattered through the houses below. Elias Webb moved between the homes in those days with the steady, unhurried calm of a man who had seen the aftermath of hard things many times in his long life. He helped each family take the measure of what they had lost and what could still be saved, and where to begin. He said little. He simply went where he was needed and did what wanted doing and moved on. Some of the homes were soon livable again. A chimney cleared, a fire relit, a family carried back to its own hearth. A few of the homes were not. The cold had gotten too far inside them, and those families stayed on in the small house on the ridge a while longer, until other arrangements could be made. The girl made room. She had grown used to making room. And a strange and quiet thing happened in those days of leaving. The people did not leave the way they had come. The two young sisters, before they went, came to her shyly and pressed into her hands a small drawing they had made together. It was a drawing of the stove, lopsided and earnest, the gray stone colored in with the stub of a pencil, and beside it, small stick figures of all the people it had held. The girl looked at it for a long moment, and then she pinned it to the wall above her work table, where it would stay. The other family, the parents of the two girls, did not have grand words, but the father stopped at the threshold and took off his hat, and held it, and looked at her. "We won't forget this," he said simply. "Not ever. Not as long as we live." And then he carried his life back down the hill. Della Hartwell was among the last to go. The old woman had ruled the cooking shelf through the whole long storm with her calm and certain hands, stretching a little food into enough day after day, the way only a woman who has fed people through hard times truly knows how to do. And on the morning she was to leave, she did not hurry. She moved slowly around the small house, the way the old move, taking the measure of a place. She ran one wrinkled hand along the smooth gray plaster of the stove. She looked at the shelves the girl had built, and the bed in the corner, and the careful order of it all. Then she came and sat down across from the girl at the work table, and for a while she said nothing at all. "I have lived a long time," Della said finally. Her voice was soft and worn, like cloth washed smooth. "I have seen a great many people do a great many things." She folded her old hands on the table. "I have never seen anything like what you did here." The girl looked down. She was not used to praise. She did not know where to put it. "It was only stone," she said quietly, "and a dead man's drawings. I just followed them." The old woman shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "No, child. A drawing on a page is not a warm room full of living people. The drawing was his, the warmth. She reached across the table and she laid one trembling hand over the girl's. The warmth was yours. The girl did not answer. She could not. Della Hartwell patted her hand once, gently, and then rose with the slow dignity that no weather and no hardship had ever been able to take from her. "I will come back up this hill," the old woman said, settling her shawl around her shoulders. "When the snow lets a body pass. An old woman likes company. And so, I think, do you, whether you have learned to admit it yet or not." And she went. The girl watched her go down the cleared path, small and bent and steady against the white world. And the words stayed. "And so, I think, do you." Nora Renner was the very last to leave. She stood at the threshold with baby Asa warm and pink and sleeping against her shoulder, and she turned back, and she looked at the girl for a long time. She was not a woman of grand words either. "He would have been gone by morning," she said softly. "My boy, that first night, if your door had not opened, he would have been gone." And then her voice broke, and she could not say any more. She did not need to. The girl stepped close, and she looked at the small, sleeping face against the mother's shoulder. The face that had been a frightening gray that black night, and was now flushed with warmth and life, and the deep, easy sleep of a child who is safe. "He's here," the girl said gently. "He's here, and he's warm. That's all that matters now." Nora nodded, the tears running freely down her cold, chapped face, and the two of them stood a moment in the doorway, in the cold, bright air, held together by a thing too large for either of them to lift alone. Then Nora Renner carried her son home down the hill, and the small house, for the first time in many days, was quiet. The girl was alone again. But it was not the same aloneness. She noticed it that very first night, sitting by the warm stove in the empty room. Once, the silence of that house had been a heavy thing, a reminder of how few people in all the world were thinking of her at all. Now the silence had a different weight to it, because now, when she sat alone in her warm room, she knew that down in the valley, in a small house on the South Road, a family was warm, and that they remembered, when they were warm, the night they had not been, and that they thought of her. She was alone, but she was no longer lonely, and she had learned, that long, hard winter, that there is a great wide difference between the two. A difference she had paid for in blistered hands and frozen nights and months of working with no company but a dead man's drawings. Loneliness is being unseen. And she had been seen now, truly, by the whole valley. The deep of that winter settled in around the little house, hard and long and patient, and inside it, the girl was not cold. She fired the stone heart each morning, and it gave her its steady, even warmth, and she lived inside that warmth with a peace she had not felt since before her mother had been taken from her. It was in the heart of that winter that the package came. It came through the town clerk's office, handed over by Harold Pike without a word of comment, in the way Pike handed over everything, as a fact, available for whatever use the one receiving it cared to make of it. Inside was the deed to the land at Gale's Notch, already redrawn, already stamped, with the girl's name set down as the sole owner, in careful and final language that left no room for any argument that might ever come, and folded with it a single note. In a careful hand, she knew. It read only this: "This is the thing I can set right. The rest I cannot. I will not pretend otherwise. No signature, just the deed," which said enough on its own. The girl read the note once. She waited for the rush of something. Triumph, perhaps. Or anger finally satisfied. Or the bitter sweetness of a debt collected. But none of those things came. What came instead was softer and stranger. It was the slow loosening of a knot she had carried so long that she had stopped feeling its weight. A knot tied the morning a door had locked behind her, and a man had pressed a few folded bills into her hand and called it fair. She did not forgive him exactly. Forgiveness was a larger thing, and it would come, or it would not, in its own time. But she set the knot down. She put the note in the small box where she kept the one photograph she had of her mother, and she closed the lid. Some debts are paid out loud, in a warm room, in front of people who hear them spoken, and some are paid quietly, in private, where the only witness is the person who needed it most. This one was the second kind. She let it be. And then, deep in that same winter, the blacksmith came up the ridge. Gus Holloway was not a man who climbed hills for no reason. He came with his hat in his broad scarred hands and an awkwardness on his face that did not suit a man so large and so sure. He stood in her doorway and he looked at the stone heart against the wall, at the iron door he had built with his own hands, the door he had built for a strange girl with a stranger drawing, never quite believing it would work. He looked at it for a long time. "It held," he said at last. It was not a question. "It held," she answered. He nodded, slow. "Folks are saying," he went on, turning his hat in his hands, "that it held a whole houseful of souls, through the worst of it, when every other fire in the valley went out." It did. He was quiet a moment, and the girl could see that he had come up the hill to say something, and that the saying of it was hard for him. Then he reached into his coat, and he drew out a small tin box. She knew it at once. Her breath caught hard in her chest. It was her mother's tin, the one she had carried out of the only home she had ever known on the worst morning of her life. The one she had emptied with hands that did not want to do it, to buy the iron door that had saved them all. "I never melted them down," Gus said quietly. He would not quite meet her eyes. "Your mother's needles. I had them right there in my hand to do it, and I couldn't. Fine work like that, made by hands that loved the doing of it. Felt like a sin to put them in the fire." He turned the tin over in his broad palm. "Kept telling myself I'd find another use for the iron in them. Some small job. Never did. They just sat on my shelf, waiting." He held the tin out to her. "They're your mother's," he said. "They were never mine to keep, and I'd not feel right keeping them after what your hands built with what you gave me for them." The girl took the tin. Her own hands were not quite steady. She opened it, and there they were, her mother's needles, bright, whole, every one of them, exactly as they had been on the day her mother's living hands had last touched them, sorted them, set them carefully away. She had thought they were gone. She had grieved them in the quiet way she grieved everything, folded up small and carried close. She had told herself it was only iron, only metal, that the love was in the memory, not the thing. And she had believed it, mostly. But now, with the little needles bright in her palm, She understood that she had not believed it at all, that some part of her had ached for them every single day, that a piece of her mother had gone into that fire in her mind, and she had simply learned to carry the loss. And now, impossibly, it was back in her hands. She did not weep in front of the blacksmith, but something inside her, something that had been clenched tight and silent for a very long time, finally, gently let go. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough. It came nowhere near enough. But it was all the words she had. And Gus Holloway seemed to understand that. He set his hat back on his head. He nodded once, and he made his slow, heavy way back down the hill. And the girl stood in her warm house, holding her mother's needles in her two hands, and for the first time since the cold ground had taken her, she felt her mother near. Not as a wound, as a presence. Some things, she understood then, are not truly lost. They only wait, the way the dead man's drawings had waited in the wall, year after silent year, the way the wildflower had waited under the snow. They wait for the moment a person is ready to receive them again. And as that hard winter wore on toward its end, Della Hartwell kept her word. When the snow let a body pass, the old woman came up the hill. She came slowly, with a basket on her arm, and she settled into the chair by the stove, as though she had always sat there. She did not require much talking. She would knit, and the girl would work. And now and then, the old woman would say a small thing, a memory, a scrap of wisdom worn smooth by a long life, and then fall quiet again. It was not the same as having a mother. Nothing would ever be that. But it was a warmth of its own. The warmth of an old woman and a young one, sitting together in a warm room, needing nothing from each other but the company. And the girl found, to her own quiet surprise, that she had begun to look forward to those visits, that she would catch herself listening for the slow step on the path, that the empty chair by the stove had started to look empty in a way it never had before. She was being woven, thread by thread, into something. She had not had that in a very long time. She had almost forgotten what it felt like. The spring came on with a soft, almost apologetic warmth, the way spring always comes after a winter that hard, as if the season itself were asking forgiveness for everything the cold had done. The snow drew back from the south-facing slopes first, then from the bottom of the valley, and the world that emerged from underneath it was changed, marked, the way all things are marked by what they have survived. And the girl found that spring that the valley had changed toward her, too. When she walked into the general store now, the conversation did not soften and slide away. Edith Vance, who had once shaken her head and called the girl unnatural to anyone who would listen, now met her at the counter with a careful, almost shy warmth. Edith would ask after her, would set aside a thing she thought the girl might need, would once slip an extra measure of something into her order and wave away the question of payment gruffly, as though embarrassed to be caught at kindness. It was a small thing, but the girl had learned that small things were never small at all. The librarian, Margaret Tilden, who had given her books and tea and silence when she had needed all three, now greeted her like an old friend whenever she came in. And one quiet afternoon, Margaret set down her pen and looked at the girl across the reading table where it had all begun. "You know," the librarian said, This town has been the same for a very long time. The same hard winters. The same way of meeting them. Folks here do not change their ways easily. She paused. And then a girl walked into my library with a dead man's journal pressed against her ribs and asked me for books on stone and clay. She smiled, a small and private smile. And nothing in this valley will ever be quite the same again. The girl did not know what to say to that, so she said the truest thing she had. "You let me in," she said quietly. "That first day, when everyone else had closed their doors. You didn't ask me a single question. You just let me in." Margaret Tilden looked at her for a long moment. "Some doors," the librarian said, "are meant to be opened." That spring, the sound that filled the valley was not the sound it had always filled with. It was not the sound of axes working through the long hours to feed the hungry winter fires. It was the tap of stone on stone, the scrape of a trowel, the quiet, patient, hopeful work of people building something better than what they had known. Because the valley had learned a thing that hard winter. It had learned it the only way that ever truly teaches a person anything. It had learned that the old way was not the only way, that there was a better way, a proven one that had stood, finished and waiting, on a ridge they had all laughed at, until the night it kept a houseful of souls alive. And so they came to her, not to mock, not anymore, to ask. She would walk down into the valley with her composition book under her arm, and she would crouch beside a half-built firebox in someone's kitchen corner, and she would show them, not as a teacher standing above them, but as the one person who had already made every mistake there was to make, and knew exactly where each one liked to hide. The men she helped were often twice her age. Some of them had built things with their hands their whole lives, and they listened to her, a girl of 16. They listened because what she told them was plainly, demonstrably right, and because the proof of it stood up on the ridge, having held against the worst the cold could bring. Gideon Renner built his stone heart in the corner of his own kitchen, with his wife watching over the mortar and the girl correcting the angles, and old Elias Webb come out of his rest one last time to show, with his own scarred hands, the trick of a tricky channel turn. And when Gideon's stove was finished and lit and held its first warm night, the big farmer who had once stood at the feed store and called her a fool came up the ridge himself to tell her. He did not have a speech. He stood in her doorway, much as the blacksmith had, turning the matter over in his slow and honest mind. "It works," he said finally, "just like yours. Held the whole night through, and into the morning. The little ones slept warm. My wife slept the whole night, for once, instead of getting up to feed a fire." He paused and looked at his own hands. "I keep thinking about what I said, down at the store, about you." "You already told me that," the girl said gently, "in the storm. You don't have to carry it twice." Gideon Renner looked at her, and something in his weathered face eased. "My grandfather had a saying," he said, "about the people who call a thing impossible. I told it to you once in the storm, and I wasn't sure I had it right." He nodded slowly. "I've decided he did say it. I've decided to believe he did." And he went home to his warm house and his sleeping children and his wife who could rest at last. The girl watched Elias Webb go down the road that final time, after the work in the Renner kitchen was done, slow and bent and certain, and she understood, watching him, what the old man had truly given her. It was not only the corrections, not the bread, or the trick of the channel turn. It was something she had never had a name for, back when she needed it most. The whole valley had looked at her and seen a foolish girl playing at stone. He had looked at her and seen a builder. And she understood now that this was the rarest gift one person could ever hand another. Not help, not even kindness, just the act of looking hard at someone and believing in the shape they might become, long before that shape was ever there to see. It was the same gift her mother had given her once, over a sewing pattern with a needle in her hand, and she hoped, watching the old man make his slow way down the hill, that one day she might give it to someone too. She did not have to wait long at all. It was an evening near the close of that spring. The girl was sitting at her work table in a house that was a proper home now, a real window in the east wall that let in the long gold light, a real bed in the corner, built and left at her door, without a note, by an old carpenter who had always thought notes were a waste of good words, the children's lopsided drawing pinned to the wall, the tin of her mother's needles on the shelf, where she could see it every day. There came a small knock at the door. She opened it, and there, in the soft evening light, stood a small girl, the Renner child, Posy, bundled up in a coat, with a composition book of her own clutched tight against her chest, and a stub of pencil gripped in her mittened hand. She had her father's directness, and her mother's steady eyes. "My papa says you can read building drawings," the child announced. Her breath made small clouds in the cooling evening air. "He says you could read them even back when you didn't know one single other thing about building. I want to learn how to do that." She paused, with the careful seriousness of a child delivering a speech she had been practicing the whole long way up the hill. "My mama said I should come ask you, and I brought my very own book." The girl looked down at the child for a long, long moment. This was the older sister of the baby who had so nearly slipped away into the dark that black night in the storm. The daughter of the family she had taken in, standing now at her door in the warm, spilling light, asking for the very thing that had once saved them all, without having any idea that that was what she was truly asking for. And something settled then, deep in the girl's chest. Something that finally, after all the long, cold months, felt like peace. She had walked away once from a door that locked behind her with a small and final click, with everything she owned in a single worn bag, and not one soul in all the wide world who was bound to her, or who would have noticed if she simply ceased to be. And somehow, against every reason there was, she had arrived here, at a door of her own, in a home of her own, with a child standing on the other side of it, looking up at her, not with pity, and not with mockery, but with trust, with hope. A child who had come, of all the doors in all the valley, to hers. Behind the girl, the lamp threw its warm gold light out across the threshold, and onto the last of the snow that still lingered, soft and blue, in the deepest shadows of the eaves. The room at her back was warm. It was always warm now. "Come in," she said gently, and she stepped aside and opened the door wider. "But take your coat off first. It's warm enough in here that you won't be needing it." Posy Renner walked through the door, and the girl, the young woman she was quietly becoming, closed it softly behind them both, Closing out the last of the evening cold, the stone heart held the room at its quiet, even warmth, the way it always did now, the way it always would, asking for nothing, giving everything it had, indifferent to all the doubt it had survived and all the laughter, and all the long and lonely months it had taken one pair of hands to build. The girl pulled a second chair up to the work table. She opened her own composition book beside the child's small one, and she found a fresh page and a sharpened pencil, and she drew a single clean line. "We'll start here," she said softly, "with just one line. Everything else comes from this." And the child leaned in close, her small face serious in the lamplight, and watched. And the girl began, in a soft and patient voice, the very way her own mother had once begun with her, long ago, with a needle instead of a pencil, to teach a small pair of hands how to look at a flat and simple drawing, and to trust the lines, and to believe in the shape they would become, long before that shape was ever there to see. The cold had taken so much from her, her mother, her home, the last small belief that anyone in all the world was bound to her. But the cold, she had learned, did not only take. Sometimes, in the slow and patient and stubborn way of stone giving back the heat it has held, the cold gave something too. It had given her this warm room, and the old woman who climbed the hill to sit in it, and the family below who remembered her in their warmth, and the town that had finally opened its doors, and her mother's needles returned to her hands when she had given up on ever holding them again. And now, this, a small hand reaching toward hers in the lamplight. She had set out into the world with a tin of her mother's needles and a few folded bills and nothing else at all. And she had built, out of cold stone and a dead man's quiet faith, and the lessons living in her own two hands, a home. Not only a house that knew how to hold the heat, but a home that had learned, at long last, how to hold a heart. And that, she understood now, in the warm and patient lamplight, with a child bent over a drawing at her side. That was the thing she had truly been building all along.